Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Reva. I'm a senior in Questrom studying finance and law. And today we're going to be talking about Virginia's unique policy of felony disenfranchisement, specifically how felons in Virginia permanently lose the right to vote when they are convicted of a felony. Before I begin, I want to thank my advisor, Brooke Williams, who was absolutely pivotal in this presentation and throughout my paper, really in the entire research process to make sure that we were getting the quality we deserve for this kind of work. Before we jump in, it's pretty important to make sure we go through some definitions to make sure we're all on the same page about what exactly we're covering. Then we're going to go to talk about how this kind of policy has been applied in Virginia and how it's currently working today. And all of this will culminate so we can answer really two basic questions. Are there any kind of political or demographic factors that affects who's disenfranchised and who's reinstated in Virginia? So, jumping into some definitions, in Virginia, felony disenfranchisement is defined as a person who has been convicted of a felony that loses their right to vote unless the governor approves their petition for reinstatement. Now, this is really two critical things you have to remember about this kind of process. First, at this stage, it has to be a felony. I want you to remember that because that's going to change later. And secondly, this is very unique across the entire United States. In most states, you certainly lose your right to vote while you're in prison, and in some states when you're on parole or probation. But Virginia has this indefinite period of disenfranchisement where you really can't vote unless you're approved by the governor. That's unlike anything throughout the country. So to investigate why that deviation occurred, I found that it was really based in this concept of civil death that comes from the Enlightenment period in English common law. And it's this concept where an individual commits a crime, they willingly violate the social contract. And in doing so, the government doesn't have to recognize their rights, including the right to vote. And what I wanted to investigate is whether this Enlightenment principle was active in our body of law today, and whether this might be influencing Virginia right now. And unfortunately, I did find a lot of carryover, especially in the Reconstruction Amendments, which is very shocking because we tend to associate these amendments with some of the most expansive liberations of our civil liberties. But here we see that's actually putting a pretty big categorical exclusion for felons across each of these amendments. But what's critical when you look at these amendments is that there's no specified length of time. That was left up to the states, and what we see post-Reconstruction is that a lot of states started to adopt this more explicitly in their constitutions. And that's where Virginia made it an automatic process, that the minute that you are convicted, you automatically become disenfranchised. And we see this disenfranchisement rate pick up, especially when you have the enforcement of black codes, allowing for convictions to occur much more easily. Conversely, on the other hand, we see reinstatement become more and more stringent. So in this case, we have people who have to complete their sentence 5 years, including parole and probation. Now, in this case, they also have to have no misdemeanors or felonies, which is very unique because before it was a felony, but now if you committed a crime when you were 18 and later when you're 24, you might accidentally shoplift something, you've now permanently lost the right to vote with no recourse for ever getting it back. And lastly, we have this huge caveat, which is that you have no chance for appeal once the governor renders a decision, whichever governor that might be, which is very unique. Except for the Supreme Court, you can pretty much appeal every single decision in the entire U.S. state and federal system leading up to the Supreme Court, and this is one of the unique situations where that appeal is removed. So I wanted to see how this kind of process was being implemented in Virginia, and so I first investigated through time to notice whether or not an election might have an impact. So on the top, we see in blue the rate of felony disenfranchisement from 2007 to 2020, and we see that's much more volatile. It tends to increase and decrease pretty regularly. And at the bottom, we see the rate of reinstatement, which steeps off heavily in 2007 and never really recovers to that rate, and it stays pretty stagnant regardless of an election. And what's poignant here is the year 2016, where we have a very, very contentious election, and we see the rate of felony disenfranchisement jump nearly 20 times the rate of reinstatement. A very increased and prolonged spike throughout that month, and then that steeps off immediately in 2017. So I wanted to investigate whether this was concentrated in any kind of counties and whether or not the vote may have been playing a part. So then I looked at the geography, and this is where we see the distribution of those who are disenfranchised. We see that's mostly in the southern and western coast of Virginia. Conversely, we see the reinstatement is concentrated mostly in the northeast. Now, when you look at these two graphs together, there's two key takeaways here. First, that the areas with the most disenfranchisement are not the areas that have the highest reinstatement, which includes that this implies that there might be some other kind of third-party factor guiding these decisions for disenfranchisement and reinstatement. Secondly, we see there's a difference in degree. Even in the counties with the highest rates of reinstatement, we do not see it counteract the rate of disenfranchisement, meaning that over time, there's more people being disenfranchised that are ever being reinstated. So then I wanted to investigate what might be driving these differences if there is a third-party factor. And that's where we kind of see these regressions being run. And the statistically significant factors for disenfranchisement was that counties that tended to vote more Republican and counties that tended to have more women tended to have the highest rates of disenfranchisement. And then on the other hand, for reinstatement, counties that tended to be more white tended to have lower incomes and tended to have more percent of the population living below poverty, tended to have higher rates of reinstatement, which shows again there's a political or a demographic factor guiding these decisions beyond just the plain language of the law. So this is where we have some really important takeaways. If there is an unequal application, either guided by political or demographic factors, this could indicate a violation of the 14th Amendment in the unequal access to the voting ballots. And that would be challenged to the Supreme Court in the coming years, or even in Virginia itself with a referendum to try to amend this clause of the Constitution. Right now, it's a very, very contentious debate within Virginia about whether or not this referendum will occur and actually pass. But kind of research like this will become more and more important to investigate these questions to really try to pinpoint where that change might occur. At this point, I'll be taking any questions you might have about these results or any of the process that I conducted. Thank you very much.
Hi, great presentation. I thought that was really informative. Did you find that there was anything that could be done at a federal level besides the Supreme Court making a decision to counteract like the state's decisions about these kinds of laws, or is there just like nothing that can be done besides that?
Yeah, that was actually one of the important questions I was trying to figure out in the takeaways. I think given the changing composition of the Supreme Court, it's less likely that it's going to be challenged now. I think one strategy could be the legislator passing a bill that specifically limits the period to which the 13th and 14th Amendment, that exclusionary clause occurs. So at least you can say it's only up to 5 years after your sentence is complete. So you explicitly outline it, and then it would be a violation of federal law in that sense.
Hi. So how did you get onto Virginia as the state of disenfranchisement? Because I understand that you're saying Virginia is one of the only states, if not the only state, that has this kind of policy where it's so unique. So I was just wondering what your research process was to get into finding Virginia as a state that does this.
Mm-hmm. So across the U.S., pretty much every state has some sort of policy of disenfranchisement, and there was only 3 that had this indefinite period. Florida passed Amendment 4 in 2018, where they're in the process of removing this from their entire body of law. Kentucky is very much showing no movement in this kind of policy. And Virginia is the one that has it indefinitely, but they're showing a lot more contention about whether or not there might be a referendum to remove this from the Constitution. And I thought given that possibility, it might be more important to make sure that the general body population who do have the right to vote can know this information a little bit more to make an informed choice in a referendum.
Is there consistent patterns with the areas that have higher levels of reinstatement and voting patterns? And do we see change in do we see any change in location or density of reinstatement based on the actual governor that's in leadership at the time?
Mm-hmm. So for that period of my research, the regressions, that was only a cross-section of 2020. My concern was that I didn't have access to any kind of FOIA request from the Bureau of Prisons or the Board of Elections to actually figure out the statistics of who was being released in the intermediate, but they were required to report it for the census, which is what overlapped in 2020. So it was the only period that I could really get that kind of relationship occurring. But this could be more interesting if you compare it, for example, to 2030 coming up if there's an election.
You mentioned before in answering someone else's question about wanting this pursuing this particular research in Virginia because it's like an active conversation and sharing this information to people who are able to vote. And so I'm just curious if that has been part of your project or perhaps the next step and how you hope to or plan to communicate your results and findings to that crowd.
It's definitely been a point of interest for me since high school, so this is something I've been researching for a very long time. It's something that I hope to continue researching when I go on to law school. Right now, the current project is I'm trying to get it published through some various academic journals, and then hopefully once that is cleared, it can be published to a more general audience. Right now, there's no current referendum pending at all this year for Virginia. I'm hoping that more likely once the next election of the governor occurs, that will probably become more of a larger conversation at that point, and that's what I'm hoping to become it more public within Virginia itself.
Oh, sorry. I thought your presentation was amazing. I really liked that one slide that pointed out the, I think it was 20 times higher, the disenfranchisement rate in 2016, given the presidential election. And I was wondering, was that something that was unique to Virginia, that like exponentially higher disenfranchisement rate, or was that something that was actually found within other states? I think you mentioned Florida also has somewhat of a similar policy in place. So.
So Florida tended to have I didn't research Florida's rate specifically for the 2016 election, but based on my personal knowledge, Florida tended to have more controversy regarding the 2000 election with Al Gore and the clipped ballots, and that's where it became a bigger conversation where there's various studies that have shown that if felons were allowed to vote in that election, that actually Al Gore would have taken Florida and won the election in 2000. So that's when this conversation really started to increase, but unfortunately I wasn't able to compare it in the 2016 election itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.